house. Hello, everybody, and welcome to your first breakout session of the day. Our session is called Thinking Forward on Race and America. I'm Susan Adams, and I'm the regional coordinator for our Third Coast region. It is my true pleasure and honor today to introduce you to our speaker, Mr. John Wood Jr., Director of Public Outreach with Braver Angels. John is a writer, public intellectual, and political figure from Los Angeles, California, whose work has focused on creating dialogue and understanding between polarized communities. Interesting fact, in 2014, John was California's youngest active nominee for Congress, his campaign being notable for its nonpartisan focus and its emphasis on cultivating empathetic collaboration across political and racial divides. Subsequently, John was elected vice chairman of the Republican Party of Los Angeles County. John is joining us today from Los Angeles, where he lives with his wife and 3 children. Thanks so much for being with us here today, John.
Thank you, Susan. Well, it's good to be back speaking with members of CCL, and some of you will notice I have a little bit more hair this time around than I had last time. Last time I paid you guys a visit, so you know, there's just part of the style of the times, I guess. First of all, let me just say that as an organization, Braver Angels is very grateful to have the friendship of the Citizens Climate Lobby on a number of levels. In fact, as I understand it, we are actively engaged in some partnership work. There is an action team that is active at the moment that has executive sponsorship within CCL, exploring areas of collaboration and coordination between Braver Angels and Citizens Climate Lobby. We've already worked together on some particular programs oriented around depolarization and dialogue. And I think that many of you folks can expect to see some of that activity coming to your region sometime soon. So keep an eye out for that. And that's something that I'm very excited about. Now, the reason I'm here talking to you guys today is because you know, beyond ordinary party politics, beyond so many of the issues that we all care about, I think that we all know and feel that we are in a moment that represents a striking crossroads for the United States of America. And with all of the many things that were already just desperately troubling for us, we're dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, with the ensuing economic contraction that took place, political polarization at a high point. But now in the midst of all of that, ancient passions and grievances and difficulties over race have flared up in the American conversation, in American life, in a way that has felt, I think, jarring, emotional, challenging, destabilizing, perhaps in some of its effects. But I think that also opens the road for our being able to pursue the community that we actually want to see in America. I know it's hard to imagine in this moment where there's so many things that seem so difficult, so many challenges that are so daunting. But the truth is that I think that the moment we are in does provide the potential, I think, for some greater listening. And in that space, I think that we have the power, organizations like ours, individuals like you and like me, and Americans of goodwill from across the political and cultural spectrum, to sow the seeds for a renaissance in our civic cultural life that I think can make good on the promise of a more perfect union and on the promise of the beloved community that Martin Luther King Jr. spoke into our moral language some decades ago. So before I sort of go in that direction, I think that for me, it is worth taking the time to sort of talk a little bit about how we got to where we are at present. Now, there are all sorts of stories to be told in American history and about the Black experience in particular. Some of you folks know a bit about my personal background. For some of you, this will be new information. I'm a person who comes from a multicultural, bipartisan to a certain degree, and biracial family background. Some of you may have heard me say this, but when I was running for Congress, Susan alluded to my campaign back in 2014. I was at the age of 26, running in a district in Los Angeles that was diverse, that was, complicated socioeconomically. People would ask, what makes you qualified to run for one of the most complicated districts in California? Now, people would ask that whether I was speaking to a white Tea Party group in the South Bay or a Black Democratic church in South Los Angeles. And each time I had the same answer. I'd say I come from a diverse and unique sort of family background in some ways. My mother's a liberal Black Democrat from inner city LA. My father's a Republican from Tennessee. I grew up explaining my mother, my father, my mother, and that's why I think I can relate to all of you. Tended to get a laugh. A level deeper in that story, though, is the fact that I have lived a particular version of the Black experience in America. And I've been blessed, honestly, in my own estimation, to be a Black man in America, because in my own particular context, growing up in Culver City, California, in a multicultural community that is well integrated, where I trusted the institutions around me, where I tended to feel that the teachers, the local politicians, the police officers for that matter, I tended to think that these were people who had the best interests of my community at heart and who had the best interests of myself at heart, even as a young Black man. Because in the community that I grew up in, I looked at the integration that I benefited from and thought of the history of the civil rights movement. I remembered Dr. King's promise, his dream, and I felt that I was growing up in the America that Dr. King helped pave the way for. And I did. I got to enjoy that upbringing, even as a young man of color. And I'm very grateful for that. Part of growing up, though, and part of coming from a Black family on my mother's side that was sort of widely distributed in terms of where we were coming from, biographically, geographically, was taking notice of the fact that a lot of my cousins and relatives in inner city America, and inner city Los Angeles in particular, I should say, were coming from a set of circumstances, even though they only lived several miles away from me, that was different from my own. A lot of people look at the protests that we see in the streets right now, and well, for some folks, it seems perfectly obvious that, there are all sorts of grievances that people have a right to be upset about, even beyond the salient and just, unspeakably obscene death of George Floyd. For other people, there is some confusion. There's some wondering, well, wait a second. I thought that things were better than this in America. The anger is taking some people by surprise, and many of us are worried that our national response to the issue of police and social injustice, some of us want to push harder and faster in the direction of true and meaningful equality. Others say, well, wait a second, let's take a look at the price that our communities are paying and try and understand what's going on. And in the midst of all of this, there becomes a need to understand the genuine depth and breadth of the Black experience. We all know that the Black experience in America begins with slavery. We know that transitioning out of slavery, we wandered into a wilderness as African Americans of terrorism from groups like the Ku Klux Klan, poverty and peonage in the rural South. You cut across the latter part of the 19th century and into the 20th century, and you have the migration of African Americans to urban centers in places like Los Angeles, which is where my mother's family moved to over the course of the 30s and 40s and 50s. And as a matter of fact, in that time, many Black people moved into the locations that are now called projects to work in munitions factories to supply the war effort in World War II. But after World War II came and went, jobs disappeared. And then we move into the period of the 1960s, where you have the decapitation of Black leadership, the death of Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr. But you have the success, the moral triumph of the nonviolent movement and the civil rights movement. And for many Americans, there is the sense that, well, wait a second, wasn't the battle won there? I grew up believing that as a Black man myself, because in my own particular pocket of America, I was living that multicultural reality that spoke to the idea that America could be a place where you were judged by the content of your character as opposed to the color of your skin. But for many other Black Americans, coming out of the 1960s, going into the 1970s and 80s, with the advent of drugs in American life that found themselves concentrated in inner city environments, with the expansion of the role of the federal government in the lives of Black Americans, with a police response that became vast and aggressive and bearing down in a regulatory fashion upon the Black community, responding to genuine concerns over peace and safety from the American community. but nevertheless paying a high price in terms of damaging relationships between the Black community and law enforcement, and leading us to the situation of mass incarceration, with which I think folks in this call are likely going to be familiar. There was an avenue of the Black experience, for reasons that were complicated but nevertheless real, that proceeded through an ensuing story of struggle for many Black folks. Not all, but for many. And that takes us up to the early 90s or so, which is the point at which I start to remember life in America. So I was born in 1986. And in 1992, when I was 5.5 years old, the Los Angeles riots sparked up in the aftermath of the beating of Rodney King. And I remember that as a faint sort of shadow in my mind. I can remember living in middle-class Culver City, California, with my mother and my father and my little brother, that there was some tension in the air, that there was something going on outside of the house that was troubling. I remember my parents being nervous. And later on, my dad would tell me, my mother went to work on one of those days when so much of LA was up in flames. And she went to work, and my dad said that later on, he said that was the most frightening moment of his life, because he wasn't sure that we would ever see her again. He said, "My God, why did I let her go?" But she came back that evening. She had a fright on her way to work. But she came back that evening, and life went on. 15 miles away, the woman I would marry 15 years later, current Mrs. Wood, she was 4, and she was living in a war zone. She's from the Jordan Downs projects in Watts. That's where my wife grew up. And her earliest memories of life in America are of gunfire and explosions, murder and death in the streets, in reaction to the police beating and brutalizing of a man in an incident that seemed to symbolize the entire relationship between the Black community and law enforcement, and so much of the relationship between Black America and the United States of America, institutionally speaking, in general. She remembers seeing her community go up in fire in her very earliest moments of consciousness. And that's where her American story begins. And over the course of her life as a Black woman, 15 miles away from me in the same county, she lived a life seeing the failures of the educational system, police corruption and brutality, economic poverty and despair, and a set of circumstances that convinced her, as it has convinced so many African Americans living this story, that the American dream is not meant for her or for people like her. Now, the story is always more complicated than just that. She served in the US military. Her and I are raising a family in South LA, erstwhile South Central Los Angeles right now. And our 3 children have the world to look forward to. Part of what I've started saying in talking about her story and mine is that, we, each of us, represent sort of a pole in the Black experience. I think that the lives of most Black Americans fall somewhere in between hers and mine. But in that spectrum of existence lies a spectrum of American experiences that are seeking to make themselves heard now in this moment. And so what is the potential of the moment that we're in? I don't think that the existence of either my wife's story or my own presupposes the answer, particularly not on a policy level, to every question of social justice or historical interpretation in America. These questions are complicated. The interpretation of our history, of our current policies, economic and other disparities. What we do know, right, left and right, Black and white in America, I believe, is that we have fallen short of the true calling of justice and equality in this nation. But how we get there has to be a question of how is it that we go about living up to the higher ethical traditions that inform our civic culture, that inform our civic and social life. The power of Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent movement was that it rested on the assumption that love is a transformational force in human interaction and also in social endeavor and in the pursuit of social justice. Dr. King was able to lead a movement that humanized the opposition, even the most virulently racist among them, because he stood on this idea, on this principled notion that there is goodness in the heart of each individual, and that we empower ourselves when we speak to the conscience of the opposition. And even if the opposition, the individual you're talking to, doesn't believe or understand what you're saying in the moment, you still unshackle yourself from the bitterness of hatred that keeps us from being able to be at peace with ourselves and our neighbors. My hope for this moment, and the efforts that I work on, the efforts that I think the folks on this call can help to lead, is to create a context for our cultural conversation in America that allows for the nuances of all American experience and all American suffering to express itself. And within that space, finally allow for the full-throated articulation of the particular struggles of the Black experience to make themselves known, to come forward. But that in having this conversation, we allow for the true nuances at play in our circumstances to be made available for a good nature, for a good faith interaction that can inform what we do in America today as a matter of policy. In other words, providing space for a conversation that builds our connection to each other as brothers and sisters in this country in pursuit of the beloved community, and does not destroy them. And so that is the negative possibility of the moment. That is the fear that in our zealousness, either for justice or to oppose social forces that we think are moving too fast, we forget to actually create the space for us to listen to one another constructively. This is a moment, though, where I do believe the American people are listening. Can we create the space so that we can listen to each other without fear? Can we create the space to where we can listen to each other with genuine understanding? Diving into the resources of civil society, through organizations like Braver Angels, in indirect fashions, by modeling the type of political and collaborative and coalitional culture that Citizens Climate Lobby itself has modeled. There are organizations across this country, there are towns, cities, and volunteer associations and fraternities that have the resources to build out the networks of connection, of communal communication in this country in a manner that can reset the cultural dialogue if we invest in that capacity, in the philanthropic space, possibly in the public space, in the private space as well. We can launch and we can pursue a civil response, a civil society response to the divisions of our moment that allow us to hear and to feel and to fully take in the expressions of pain and the need to be heard from a group of people who genuinely have suffered. But we can translate that into a larger American conversation that we can act upon to build towards a more perfect union and to finally realize that greater dream of liberty and justice for all people and for all Americans. And so in this moment, hold tight to the idea that this America is possible. Not only is it possible, it is achievable. And that as difficult as things are right now, it is always darkest before the dawn, and a dawn will break in which we will have the America that we have truly believed in and sought. Because I've seen it in my own life. I've seen it in my family. I've seen it in my community. You've seen it in the best parts of America. And the better parts of America can become the America that we all want to see. So believe it, and it will happen.